One specific argument I heard from them was something along the lines, and I saw different variants of it, but the idea was, of course we can't support this thing because it is just going to load up more debt, even compared to the status quo, right? It's not just that in absolute terms the debt goes up, but the debt goes up even more with this plan than it would if the government did nothing and just kept the current legislation in place. And so how the heck can any decent fiscal conservative support such a thing? Because the more debt we load up, that just causes inflation and for our children and grandchildren. And why don't we just do the responsible thing and close the deficit now, ideally through spending cuts, but even if not that, then yes, through tax hikes. Okay, so I heard lots of different variants of those types of ideas. And so the function of this particular hypothetical fiscal reform that I'm going to walk through here in a minute for you folks is to try to tease those things out. And so specifically the big picture, where am I going with this? This plan that I'm showcasing here, it involves a very large increase in the near term in the budget deficit, right? The annual mismatch between federal spending and receipts. But so long as the plan were followed, but it does involve very large and continual spending cuts. The reason the deficit goes way up in the short term is it phases out the income tax completely.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I am rolling solo and I am going to walk through the assumptions I made for a recent blog post I put up at the Infineo website. Of course, I'll link to that, the show notes page here for this episode. And it has to do with an aggressive plan for fiscal reform. So the context here is in the arguments, and as you can imagine, when I'm on social media, my feed tends to be dominated by conservative and libertarian types. And so I was very interested in seeing the arguments recently within that community over the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill that recently passed Congress after some revisions. And so my purpose in putting forth this hypothetical plan for fiscal reform over the next 10 years is not that this is the Murphy proposal, right? I'm not saying, hey, everybody, this is what I think the government should do. Would this be better than the Big Beautiful Bill and what Thomas Massie and Rand Paul? This is the thing that really threads the needle. That's not what I'm saying. So please don't misunderstand me. So if you're interested in this and you share it with somebody else or retweet it or something, please don't say, oh, did you guys see Bob Murphy's proposal for what he thinks ought to be? That's not what this is. Rather, the point of this is just to provoke thought. It's sort of like, if you're a philosophy professor and your students have certain views about what the right thing to do is in various situations, you might come up with what's called trolley problems. Maybe you've heard of that class of thought experiment where it's like, oh, the trolley's coming down and you have the power to pull the switch and make it go one track, to the left or the right. Once it comes up to the decision tree, there's various types of things that happen to unfortunate souls. It's usually bad things either way. That's kind of the deal. And hey, that's a good metaphor for what we're talking about in this episode. No matter what the U.S. government does, there's bad things either way. And then the issue is just to get people to think about their framework and apply it in a weird situation that is designed to tease out and make distinctions between things that are often lumped together. Okay, so coming back to the fiscal context here, instead of my analogy with the trolley problem, the issue I saw with various people arguing is they were saying things like, no, we can't increase people who are opponents of the Big Beautiful Bill would say things like, and again, I'm talking about people on the right, conservative/libertarian types who are for small government, who think the government's way too big, is doing too much, is spending too much money. Obviously, there's a whole host of people who oppose the Big Beautiful Bill coming from the left as progressives who think the government ought to be helping the disadvantaged. And so they oppose some of the cuts that were in this thing because they thought it cut too much. All right, but those aren't the people I'm talking about in this episode. I'm talking about people who thought the Big Beautiful Bill didn't do enough in terms of reducing the footprint of the federal government. And so, as I say, one specific argument I heard from them was something along the lines, and I saw different variants of it, but the idea was, of course we can't support this thing because it is just going to load up more debt, even compared to the status quo, right? It's not just that in absolute terms the debt goes up, but the debt goes up even more with this plan than it would if the government did nothing and just kept the current legislation in place. And so how the heck can any decent fiscal conservative support such a thing? Because the more debt we load up, that just causes inflation and for our children and grandchildren. And why don't we just do the responsible thing and close the deficit now, ideally through spending cuts, but even if not that, then yes, through tax hikes. Okay, so I heard lots of different variants of those types of ideas. And so the function of this particular hypothetical fiscal reform that I'm going to walk through here in a minute for you folks is to try to tease those things out. And so specifically the big picture, where am I going with this? This plan that I'm showcasing here, it involves a very large increase in the near term in the budget deficit, right? The annual mismatch between federal spending and receipts. But so long as the plan were followed, but it does involve very large and continual spending cuts. The reason the deficit goes way up in the short term is it phases out the income tax completely. Okay. And so I was, again, trying to disentangle things to say, like, if you're saying I'm in general in favor of tax cuts, like I like the government letting people keep more of their money. That's a common way of describing what a tax cut is, right on the right. I said, okay, so if you're saying it's their money, then yeah, you should let people keep more of it. In and of itself, that's a good thing. And you're also saying, another thing running around too is people were saying and sharing clips from Milton Friedman saying, like Elon Musk has shared clips like this in opposition to the big beautiful bill, saying the true metric of government's footprint in the economy, or the burden of government that ultimately the people have to bear, is how much it spends. And the level of current taxation is kind of irrelevant, because even if they give you a tax cut in the near term, if they're still spending as much as they otherwise would have, well, that's just adding to the debt. And so the people are going to be taxed down the road with either inflation or higher interest on that larger debt burden. And so the government's not doing us any favors. They're not giving us actual relief by giving us a tax cut right now if they're still spending like drunken sailors. So what's interesting in this proposal I'm going to show you is there is very large and immediate spending reductions. So if you think, the ultimate measure or metric of the government's burden on the economy is how much it's spending, then you should be in favor of what I'm going to show you. But again, if you keep coupling that with, because otherwise, it's just racking up more debt for our descendants, well, that's what this plan is going to do too. And so again, I'm just trying to show that there's a lot of these things that are often getting conflated in the admittedly truncated discussion you're going to see on social media. Okay, so that's enough context here just to show you the function of this. It's more to help you realize something like this is at least in principle possible, so you can refine your own internal framework for how you think about these matters. Okay, so let me go ahead and start flashing this table up here periodically, and I'll comment on it. So for this one, if you're trying to listen to this in the car, it may be one of those episodes where you might want to wait for when you can be at a computer and watch the video. Okay, so the first thing is, it's got a 10-year window in the sense of I'm showing 2025 all the way through 2035. That's technically 11 years. But in any event, I did it that way just because the numbers were nice and round. But strictly speaking, when the CBO does 10-year horizons on things, it would have been like 2025 through 2034 and so forth. Anyway, the other issue here is I used the 2024 numbers, which are shown in blue. So those are a little bit lower than what, quote, the current amount is, but that's because we're not fully through fiscal year 2025, and we're certainly not fully through calendar year 2025. And so those would be estimates and, sort of year to date or period to date. So just to have definitive, solid numbers for our purposes, I thought that was more important than coming up with the best estimates about what the current period's numbers are. So that's why the things that are actually tied to the real world are in that blue column. So let me just walk through so you understand how this stuff is organized. This isn't coming from me. This is how the federal government analysts think about the fiscal position of the U.S. government. These numbers come from the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO. Okay, so interest expense, that's straightforward. That happened to have been, again, in 2024, $881 billion, right? So all the units in this table are in billions of dollars. And then the expenditures, besides the interest expense on the outstanding debt, they separate it out into what's called mandatory and discretionary spending. So mandatory spending might sound like, oh, so Congress has no say in it. Well, no, they can change it. It's just the things in the mandatory spending, they're tied to specific formulas, right? So like your Social Security benefits, it's not that Congress has to periodically keep coming up in new appropriations bills to come up with, oh, where are we going to get the money to pay for Social Security, right? Like that's sort of on autopilot unless they go in and explicitly tinker with the formula, okay? And so that's why those programs, that's what it means when they call them mandatory spending, whereas the other major category is discretionary spending, which, as the name suggests, means that they have much more discretion over how that works. But incidentally, you might think like, oh, military spending, or what's euphemistically called defense spending, that's probably mandatory, right? Because you really need it. No, that the way they group this, no. Defense spending is a big component in discretionary spending. Because again, the issue is not, is this really important? Is this something that is it a luxury we could live without? That's not what mandatory versus discretionary means in this context. No, it just means they have to continually, with new appropriations bills, come up with the money for the military budget that period. That's why it's there. Okay. So going through these numbers, Social Security was about $1.5 trillion in 2024. Medicare, which the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, Medicare is for all seniors. That's their health insurance program. That's for all seniors, whether you're a retired millionaire or whether you're struggling. Medicare covers everybody. That's not means tested, whereas Medicaid is for low-income people. Okay, so that's the distinction. Medicare was about $865 billion. Medicaid was about $618 billion. Income security programs, I think that's things like SNAP, like what used to be called food stamps and so forth. I'm pretty sure like that's the kind of thing that's in that category, which again, Congress can change those formulas, but it's kind of on autopilot. Like if you're a mom with this many, single mother with this many kids of these ages and your income is such and such, what are you entitled to from the federal government in terms of income support, right? So that's not that program has to keep coming up and get in the Congress has to keep allocating funds for it. It's sort of programmed in formulaically, and then it's just, well, it's going to cost whatever it's going to cost. And hey, if there's a bad recession, that's going to cost a lot more because it's sort of baked into the cake that this is how much we pay people under these circumstances. And then we don't know how much it's going to cost until it hits, right? That was $370 billion. And then other mandatory spending, $752 billion. So the U.S. government spends so much money that in 2024, in the mandatory category, the other was $752 billion. Like that's more than a lot of countries' entire GDP. It's more than most countries' total spending. And that was just in the CBO's report when they're doing the pie charts and whatever, breaking this down for me to grab the numbers. They just said, oh, other $752 billion, just to give you an idea of how much the federal government spends. Okay. Then in the discretionary category, they lumped out defense spending, which was about $850 billion in 2024, and then non-defense discretionary, so that's sort of like the other for this category, was $960 billion. So you add all that up, the interest expense, the mandatory, and the discretionary, and it was about, well, it was $6,796 billion in total spending in 2024, according to the CBO report that I found. Okay, look at the revenue side. The personal income tax was about $2.4 trillion. The corporate income tax was $530 billion. The payroll tax was $1.7 trillion. So let me be clear about what that is. A lot of people think when we talk about, oh, income tax, and like, oh, the top such and such percent pay this amount of income tax. That's not including when you're a worker and you look at your pay stub, how much it's called FICA, how much is deducted. It's your, quote, contributions to Social Security and Medicare. Okay, so that is taken out of workers' paychecks, and That's not part of the income tax. The income tax is a separate levy on top of that. Okay. And again, like those figures you see going around, like when Mitt Romney was running for president and it became like his campaign put out, it was something like 47% of Americans don't pay federal income tax. It was something like some figure. Those Americans, many of them still paid taxes on the income they earned to the federal government. It was because of what's called the payroll tax. Okay. So just to be clear, that it's still true, high income earners still pay the lion's share of federal taxes. But I'm just saying, if you restrict your analysis to the income tax, it makes the percentage paid by, quote, the rich higher. And it might lead you to believe, oh yeah, there's a bunch of freeloaders who are, they're getting their paychecks for nothing and then nothing's being skimmed off the top. And that's not correct. All right. And especially if you add in what the state and local governments do with sales taxes and blah, blah, blah. Like just about every human being in the country is being taxed, at least at a gross level. They might be getting subsidies that offset it, but the government is taking a piece of just about everything. Okay, so it's not like there's these vast legions of people who are escaping federal taxation. That's not true. Okay, and then other revenue, $253 billion. That's stuff like excise taxes and import taxes, right? So in the last year of the Biden administration, there were tariffs in place, but they're pretty minuscule. Okay, and then you add all that up, total revenue was about $4.9 trillion. So the mismatch, how much did expenditures exceed revenue, was $1.873 trillion, right? And then, so again, the deficit is the annual figure. It is the annual mismatch. So when we say the deficit in 2024 was 1.9 with rounding trillion dollars, that means the government in that 1 year, it's a flow concept, over the course of that year, spent about $1.9 trillion more than it took in receipts. Okay. So that adds to the outstanding stock of debt. Debt is a stock concept. Deficit is a flow concept, if you understand that terminology. So the debt held by the public at the end of the period was $28.7 trillion. Okay. And so the way it works is in this table as well, every year I'm going to do the deficit as that year's mismatch between spending versus receipts. And then that number is going to be added to the stock of the prior year's ending debt. And then that's going to be the new year's ending debt. That's how that works. Okay. So the only way to make the debt start going down is if the government runs a surplus. If it takes in more in receipts than it spends, then it can use that surplus to start retiring outstanding treasury securities, people who hold IOUs from the government. The only way to make that start shrinking is you have to have a string of years where the government's taking in more in taxes than it spends. And so with what's left over, what do you do with that? Well, what happens mechanically is government bonds that are maturing. Someone bought a bond that says, oh, this year the treasury will pay the owner of this bond $10,000. Well, if the government's got a surplus that year, part of the surplus can be used. Oh, the $10,000 that's coming due on that bond, here you go. And now that's one fewer bond issued by the treasury held by the outside world. And so the outstanding stock of government debt starts shrinking. In contrast, if the government spends more than it takes in receipts, the treasury has to issue more bonds to raise the money to pay for current spending. And so the outstanding stock of treasury IOUs held by the rest of the world grows. And that's why the debt grows. Okay, one last clarification. The number I just said there, 28.7 trillion of total debt, you might think, isn't it bigger than that? Like when I hear them arguing about the debt ceiling and stuff, like I know this is 2024, but still, isn't it like above 30 trillion? And the answer is the official debt ceiling number that the latest revisions to the big beautiful bill, I think raised by 5 trillion or something, the ceiling. That refers to the gross federal debt. So how much the Treasury owes, period. Whereas the concepts that economists tend to prefer and like the CBO uses that we think is more accurate in terms of putting various governments on an equal footing is what's called debt held by the public. So the main difference is if there's debt held by a different arm of the government, that just nets out. It's like the government owes money to itself, so we don't count that as actual economically relevant debt for the organization. And so it's stuff like the so-called Social Security Trust Fund. Okay, so in the 80s, under the Reagan administration, they, quote, reformed Social Security, and they, among other things, increased the payroll tax. So workers had to pay more out of their paycheck to fund Social Security. That revitalized the finances of the program. And so there was a long stretch that ended when the financial crisis hit in 2008. But there was a long stretch there where on a typical year, the Social Security Administration would take in more in payroll tax receipts than it had to pay out to existing beneficiaries that year. So they had a surplus. So what they do with it, they invested in treasuries, right? So from the perspective of the accounting of the Social Security program itself, considered as an isolated entity, it was running surpluses, and it wasn't using the extra money to go buy gold or to buy stocks in the S&P 500 or to buy real estate. No, they were buying treasury securities, just like a pension fund or something could go load up on treasuries. Oh, these are pretty safe, dependable returns, whatever. Okay. So from the government's point of view, the Treasury's point of view, part of the outstanding total treasury debt held by the world consists of the amount of treasuries in the so-called Social Security Trust Fund. And so for these accounting purposes, they net that out because they say the government owes itself money. That's kind of goofy for these purposes. All right. So that's just what that is. And that's why it's a lower number. Okay. Now, what assumptions am I making about how this thing unfolds over time? In 2025, so the interest expense, that's mechanical. I just assume every year the annual expense to pay the interest on the outstanding debt is a flat 4% of what the prior period's ending debt stock level was. Okay, so in this one, the $1,148,000,000,000, that's just 4% times the 28.7 trillion for the prior period, the bottom row there. Those numbers come from year by year. And the reason I was careful to separate that out is, normally you might say, oh, what's the interest expense? How much is it going up? Typically, let's just extrapolate forward. But no, if you're going to model out scenarios like I am here, where you do massive tax cuts and that causes the debt to go way up, you have to explicitly build in the fact that, that's going to make your interest expense year by year also go way up. Otherwise, that's cheating, right? Because that would be a big cost of this kind of proposal. If you're going to have massive tax cuts that you hope eventually you can recover from or deal with, you still got to worry about the fact that it's going to cause the interest expense to be a lot higher in the near term than it otherwise would have been. All right. So that's why those numbers are mechanically derived from the table itself. It's not just looking at trends or something, historical trends. Okay. Social Security, I have going up in 2025. And then into 2026, it goes down by a third. And then from that, that's what you see the red shading there. And then from that point forward, it just rises 4% a year. Oh, let me mention the 4% interest rate on the government debt. That's actually, I'm bumping it up. All right. So the CBO forecasts that the yield on government debt bounces around, but that in the long run, like in the 2040s in the 2030s and 2040s up to the year 2050, CBO projects that the average yield on government debt, because it depends on the yield curve, like the interest rate the government pays on 3-month T-bills is lower than what it pays on 30-year bonds. Okay, but they're just saying, given the outstanding stock of government debt and its composition or its distribution among various maturity durations or lengths, they say on average, let's assume it's about 3.6%. All right, so I'm rounding way up to 4%, saying because this proposal involves more debt in the short term, let's assume that to keep investors happy, to keep people willing to hold this higher stock of government debt, the yield on it has to be 4% rather than 3.6. Right, so that's where I came up with that number. Okay, then I have Social Security growing 4%. As I'm saying this to you, I don't think I realize those are the same numbers. That is just a coincidence. That 4 doesn't have to intrinsically do with the 4 that I picked for the government's debt. And the idea is just that here, I'll link to in the show notes page, I have a proposal that I wrote a couple of years ago for reforming Social Security. And it basically involves letting people opt out of it so long as it doesn't hurt the government's bottom line. All right. So intuitively, there are a bunch, particularly if you think of like high income individuals, that maybe they've been paying into Social Security for their entire working career. Let's say they're, 52. So they just have a few years left where before they can start collecting if they want to, like at 59 and a half, or, some might wait further to get different amounts. But in the meantime, they're still paying tax on, the withholding tax. And so I think for people in that zone, give or take a few years either way, you could probably come up with win-win solutions where they would say, you know what, if you just let me opt out of this, where I don't have to pay the withholding tax on the income I earn going forward, I renounce my claims on future Social Security payments. Okay. And there's scenarios where they would be happy to do that, even though on paper, the present value of the future stream of Social Security payments they're giving up has a higher value or is a higher number than the present value of the tax liabilities they're being spared. And I think they would just take the certainty of, also too, because they might be assuming, especially the younger they are, like some guy who's 45 right now, he might think, yeah, there's this promised stream of future Social Security benefits. There's no way they're going to be paying at those levels by the time I get there, or they're going to push back the retirement age to 68 or something by the time it gets close for me to start collecting. And so, you know what, why don't we just lock that in and I'll take the loss right now just so I can plan. And then it would be great just to not have this taxation. Because there's also the element of some people on the margin that Social Security taxation might be causing them to earn less income than they otherwise would. So I think in general, there's plenty of people that might be something they would take advantage of, and it would actually help the government's finances. Now, to be honest, I cheated a little bit here because the way that would work is it would worsen the government's fiscal position in the short term, because if you had a bunch of people opting out, the payroll tax receipts would drop. But what you would see is the growth in Social Security payments would be slower than it otherwise would have been. So that's the way you would see the change. So here, if you want me to justify it, I could say, oh, maybe they did something on the side with other types of bonds that the Social Security Administration is allowed to administer, and that's how they do it. But in any event, rather than swamp my plan here with the particulars of my somewhat idiosyncratic proposal for how could you reform Social Security, I just said, you know what, let's assume that those savings are all brought forward in this one fell swoop of a one-time 1/3 reduction in the level of spending, and then it just grows at 4% afterward. All right, so that's what I did for this. Okay. Medicare and Medicaid, these ones are more straightforward, what I assumed. I assumed going from 2025 to 2026, because you got to give time for the reform, everything, the ducks to get into a row and everything. That's why I couldn't do it in 2025. I assumed that they got a one-time 2/3 reduction, and then from that point forward, they grow at 4%. All right. Where's the 2/3 reduction coming from? Well, Medicare and Medicaid intrinsically have to do with healthcare expenditures, right? And so if there was a way we could come up with very rapid downward adjustments in the price of medical treatment in the United States, that's what you could do. I'll link to stuff I've done on that. So the definitive thing I've done is I co-authored a book called The Primal Prescription with an ER doctor, Doug McGuff, where we went through the history of government intervention to explain why is it that health insurance is so screwed up in the United States, right? And it's not just because, it's medical care and capitalism doesn't really work when it comes to medicine. No, that's not why. People don't, there's not this problem with car insurance, right? That's a fairly competitive market, right? Imagine if when you went to buy a new car, you didn't know what the price was going to be. Like the dealer just wouldn't tell you. And then it was only after you bought the car that the dealer said, oh yeah, this is the price, but don't worry, you've got insurance that covers a lot of it. Can you imagine how screwed up that market would be, how much cars would cost if that was the way it worked? Well, that's kind of like how healthcare works right now in the United States. So say what you will about that, that's not a free market. Okay. So I think by easing things like FDA restrictions cause the cost of bringing a new drug to market to be more than $1 billion, billion with a B. All right. And so in order for the pharmaceutical companies to make back their money, they have to charge a bunch. And that's why they have rules in place like pharmaceutical companies will develop new products, sell them in the US market at a very high unit price, but then be willing to sell them in other countries for 5% of that sticker price, the same exact drug, same pills or whatever. All right. And they have laws against reimportation, right? So it's not that you might say, well, geez, if it's selling for $100 a dose in the US and it's selling for $5 a dose over in Europe, why doesn't somebody just buy up a bunch of the doses in Europe and import them? Well, because it's illegal. That's why. Okay, so I'm saying there's lots of stuff that I think the federal government could change that would allow for a very drastic reduction in the price of U.S. healthcare without a drop in quality. Okay. So that's where those numbers come from. And then again, it just grows. The reason I have these things growing over time, once just the one-shot adjustment, the level, is because the population's growing and so on. Okay. And also, we're not talking about it here, but depending on inflation, there's that issue. At the very end of this, by the way, folks, I will talk about inflation. Okay, the income security programs, I just have those dropping at $20 billion a year. And the idea is simply that as the economy is booming and doing well, which I think it will because of what we're going to do on the tax side, I think fewer people are going to need these programs. Okay, and they can put in, work requirements and stuff like that to make them less of just handouts. Okay, big one, defense. As you can see there, in 2025, I have it dropping $50 billion, and then boom, there's a 50% reduction from 25 into 26, and then I just hold it at $400 billion a year. Now, if that terrifies you and you think we're sitting ducks for the rest of the world to come in and take over, right now, the U.S. government's military budget is something like the next 9 countries put together. All right, so the number 2 and 3 are China and Russia, but I believe, I didn't go and verify this down to the penny, but I'm pretty sure ballpark, even if the U.S. government cut its military spending in half, I still think it would spend more than China and Russia put together. If not, it would be close. Okay, certainly the U.S. government would still spend more than either of them individually. All right, so what does that mean? How can we defend ourselves? Geez, if we're only spending, as much as the top 5 countries put together, whatever. Well, the other thing too is a lot of those 9 countries are U.S. allies, right? China and Russia aren't, but the rest of it is including things like the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia and stuff, right? So it's not like it's 9 hostile powers who, by our forces combined, can finally take over the great Satan. That's not the way on paper it is. So what would that entail? Well, you couldn't have a U.S. empire anymore. It would have to be, the defense spending would have to be about defending the United States from attack. It would not be running the world and keeping the world the way we want it to be. That people in Washington have an opinion about everything that happens in some other country across the ocean. That can't work if you want to get spending under control. Okay, so here for a financial podcast, I'm not going to go into that, whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea. I'm just saying that's the assumption I made, and I'm just explaining if you think cutting the military budget in half and then keeping it there would mean all of a sudden we're going to be speaking, we're going to be taken over by Islam or something. No, you have no idea what the numbers look like. It's just, and also, there's big oceans on either side, and there's Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. Okay, so anyway, non-defense discretionary spending. I forgot to mention this in the write-up at the blog post at Infineo. It's plain to see. I just assume that gets cut by $60 billion a year. And eventually goes from $960 billion in 2024 all the way down to $300 billion by 2035. So there, again, the assumption is the economy's booming. A lot of this stuff you don't need it, but also as you're shrinking other parts of the government, you can be laying off a lot of federal employees. Okay, and so the government is saving money in all these different ways if it's shrinking its operations. And I'm not dwelling on it here, but you could do stuff. For example, this is what I would do. Like if I were writing a more detailed proposal for somebody that was, more serious, that was going to be implemented, I would suggest things like if there's some government department where they're going to get rid of, well, for example, as we're going to see in a minute, we're going to get rid of the IRS, right? So all the employees of the IRS are going to get laid off. But I wouldn't just say, okay, here's 2 weeks. Good luck to you. I would do things like depending on their seniority and whatnot, pay them their continued salary or some fraction of it and phase it out over time, right? So I'm just making these numbers up, but like if you've been at the IRS for 10 years or more, you still get 1 full year of your normal pay, plus, whatever pension or something you may have acquired in the meantime. Whereas if you've only been there for 5 years or something, or between 5 and 10, maybe you get 6 months at full pay and then 6 months at half pay or something. But the point is, you don't have to come in and you can go take other jobs. We want you to do that. We want you to double dip. Okay. The point is, once these people stop going to work for the government, doing things that in many cases are counterproductive. It's not just that, oh yeah, it's kind of wasteful. It's like, no, they're doing stuff. It would be better if they just stayed home and watched TV from at least an economic efficiency standpoint, right? That we want them in the private sector producing goods and services that people actually value. And so it's fine for them to be, quote, double dipping. Like if they're still getting like, oh, this guy, he was working at the IRS for 12 years and now he gets laid off, and government, following the advice of this Murphy guy, is giving him a year at full pay of what he was used to. And now he's going and working somewhere else as an accountant. Why are we still paying him? That's crazy. He's got a full-time. That's fine. We want him to be going, right? In other words, given that they're getting paid the salary from the government because we think it's too shocking and dislocation-wise, too cruel to just all of a sudden say, hey, new program, boom, you guys are all laid off. Good luck to you. If the public thinks that, no, that's too harsh, we got to have a transition for these people. Okay. And then given that you're doing that, you want them working. You don't want them sitting at home watching TV or visiting their friends or something. You want them working in terms of what's productive for society, right? So given the option, you don't have to say you have to work. If they want to go visit their mother-in-law or whatever, or spend time with their grandkids, depending on how old they are, they can do that. But the point is, they shouldn't be penalized. They shouldn't get less of their severance package if they choose to go take another job. That's the idea. Okay. What else we got here? All right. So that's the spending side. And so you can see from 2025 to 2026, spending drops by like $2 trillion. Okay. And that it then starts rising again because the increasing interest expense and the built-in demographic increases in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid after the one-time level adjustment more than offset the continued cuts that I made in the other categories, such that federal spending still does go up over time after that one-shot adjustment. But you can see by the end, by 2035, it's at $5.3 trillion. That's still less than what it was in reality in 2024. And so over that actually 11-year stretch, the total amount that the government spends is way lower than it otherwise would have been. Okay, so you have cuts not just in spending relative to the counterfactual, but you have absolute cuts as well. Okay. So again, if your metric is the true measure of the burden of government is the amount it spends, then you should be for this plan. But let me just show you, this plan also does massively increase the federal debt. And so just make sure you understand that before you say, oh yeah, this is great, I don't need to hear anymore. Maybe you do. Okay, so back to the table. The green rows, that's showing, assuming this plan goes into effect in mid-2025, the personal and corporate income tax levels get cut in half relative to their 2024 numbers, and then they go to zero, and they stay at zero for the rest of the period. Right? So the idea is we're not just reducing the income tax, we are abolishing it. And that's important. Right? It's not that, cutting the income tax by 2/3 versus by 3/3 is just a 1/3 difference. No, if you get rid of it, and I would even do like a publicity stunt and show, like, obviously once all the people are out of the building, like demolishing it, like, having charges go off and I had the thing come down and say this was the day, in this day in history, when the IRS was eliminated and destroyed, right? That would be psychologically very reassuring to people. Like, you want them to know we're not going to have this come back in 2 years, right? You want them to think this is done. You want them to start making their plans as business owners and executives and individuals. You want them to realize, go earn as much as you want. We're not taking any of it. You get to keep all of it. And I don't think people, even people on the right, I don't think they fully appreciate just how much of a spur to economic growth that would be. Incidentally, though, let me just mention, I am not building in crazy assumptions about the beneficial effects of tax cut magic in these numbers. The way my views on that are showing up in these numbers is the stuff I said on the spending side, that I think you could have fairly aggressive cuts to some of those categories that other people might say, oh, that would cause too much pain. And I would say, well, no, not if the economy is, not if real GDP growth is higher than 7% for a few years in the beginning and then stays at 5% or higher for the rest of the period, that would do wonders for people not needing these government assistance programs. So there's that element, but also I assume the other taxes that I do keep in force, once we get to a new equilibrium, I assume that they grow at, I think I assumed 8% a year. All right, so if inflation is kept low, which I think it would be, then to have an 8% annual growth in receipts from the other tax categories, you could say, well, that's only going to happen if you've got a strong, vibrant economy. And so that's where that's coming in. All right. But other than that, I'm not building in crazy assumptions about, if they cut taxes somewhat, then the economy goes to the moon. But I do actually think that would happen. Okay. Another way of putting it is a mistake to think that, so here, look at the difference between 2024 and 2026. You say personal income tax is about 2.4 trillion, corporate income tax was about 530 billion. That's roughly 3 trillion that was taken in through the income tax in 2024. If we're showing in 2026 that it's zero, that's like a $3 trillion lump sum return to the taxpayers for that year. That's pretty good. And I'm saying, no, what the taxpayers are getting is way more than $3 trillion. Because it's 3 trillion in explicit checks they don't have to write to the government, but it's also all the compliance costs, right? You have to have armies of accountants and you structure your business activities based on the tax code. And that all goes away. And so the true economic burden to the U.S. economy of the existence of the personal and corporate income tax in 2024 was way higher than $3 trillion, which was just the explicit flow of dollars from their hands into Washington, D.C. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at. So that's why I think rather than, you might say, you could tweak these numbers, Murphy, and just cut the corporate or the personal and corporate income tax by half, and then that frees up a lot more money, but then you don't get a lot of the benefits. Another huge thing is if you get rid of the income tax, there's a huge gain in terms of privacy, that now you don't have the government in all your business, literally. Because just to comply with the income tax, it's not just the expense of having to hire the accountants and everybody to go through this stuff, but it's also the government now has its eyes on all of your activities. And there's some speculation that that's one of the functions of the income tax, is that the government kind of wants to know everything you're doing. And that's an easy way for them to have access to this information. Okay, so for other reasons besides just narrow economic issues of growth and so forth, I personally would much prefer a tax system that gets rid of income tax altogether and relies on other stuff. Okay. Payroll tax, I just have that being the same. You might say, and plenty of critics would, especially on the left who looked at this, they say, so you're giving enormous tax cuts to the wealthy, but you've got the blue-collar worker and a struggling mom who's working 2 jobs. Their tax bill basically isn't going to go down at all. They're still going to be paying the same payroll tax. Yes, but that's just because of the way Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid are structured. The payroll tax is a separate tax dedicated to those programs, at least in terms of the accounting. And so given that I'm not going to completely slash and burn those 3 programs, then, and again, to be clear, the big reductions in 2026 that I showed, that's not because people are getting less support. It's that either for the Social Security, they're opting out, they're choosing to renounce their benefits. And so that number is reflecting the present discounted value of those savings to the program. So nobody's being hurt there. And on the Medicare and Medicaid side, those aggressive spending reductions are coming from the assumed drop in the price of healthcare. All right, so it's not that people are being denied medical treatment because of cruel budget cuts from Washington. That's not what's going on there. You could say it's unrealistic, but I'm saying that's what I'm assuming for those numbers as to how to make that work. Okay. So my point being, if we're still going to have people getting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid unless they explicitly opt out, then you're going to need that payroll tax to be there. Otherwise, you'd have to have a separate discussion about how you're going to fund this stuff. All right. So that's just why I didn't mess with that, even though, yes, if we want to have a separate discussion about what's called entitlements, I would think you'd want to get rid of that too and give, deals to workers and whatnot. I guess another way of putting it is technically the payroll tax, the receipts would go down in the short term. But as I explained earlier, just the modeling of that would get complicated. And I didn't want to cloud this discussion with my particular idiosyncratic plan for reforming Social Security. So that's why I just left the payroll tax as it is and showed the net savings from my proposal as a one-shot reduction in the level of spending. Okay. The other revenue there, basically I'm assuming that they put in $500 billion up front in new tariffs, which, is consistent with what the Trump administration would do and that type of thinking. All right. So the idea is we totally get rid of the income tax and we put in new tariffs that don't come close to replacing it, but they do staunch the bleeding. All right. That they prevent the budget hole from getting too big by replacing that forfeited income tax receipt with a much more tariff revenue. All right. And so there I got it phasing in an extra $250 billion roughly in 2025. And then the number for 2026 for that other revenue category is about $500 billion higher than it originally was to show, $500 billion in new tariff receipts. And then going forward, that grows at 8% because you assume the economy grows. Okay. So for that number, again, I think I'll put it this way, the amount of imports into the U.S. would go way up given those huge personal and corporate income tax cuts, right? So people would have a lot more disposable income. They would spend some of it on imports. So the base of imports to be taxed from a tariff regime would be much bigger. So the rate they would have to apply in order to raise $500 billion in new tariff revenue is lower than you would think right now if you just looked at the numbers statically, right? So I'm just making that point. Okay. And then federal asset sales. The other thing too on that is you can't, in case you're wondering, why don't you just jack it up completely? Then we get the best of both worlds. We'll have the big spending cuts, and then why don't you just have the tariff completely replace the income tax receipts so we don't even have an increase in the deficit, and then we'll just do that. And the issue is with a tariff, so for one thing, it relatively modest rates, tariffs I don't think are that distortionary. All right, and there's a whole economic literature on that. I'll link to some stuff we've done. I think one of them at least was on this podcast, the Infi podcast, talking about what the economic literature says about tariffs, particularly for a large country like the U.S. The intuition is if you don't make the rate too high, you actually can lower the world price of the good, right? Because if you're a big component of the demand for it. And so in a sense, intuitively, some of the tariff receipts that are flowing to Washington are partly borne, at least economically speaking, by the foreign exporters who tolerate a lower price to as they're selling into the U.S. market. So even if the importer at the dock, the U.S. importer still explicitly writes the checks to Washington, if the price they have to pay for the import goes down because of this new tariff, then in a sense, it's like the foreign seller is bearing some of the burden with them. Okay. And that effect is more likely to happen the bigger your country is, the bigger component your people are of the global market, which is obviously true for the U.S. and imports. Okay. So there's that. But if you start jacking the tariff rate up too much, well, then people can just switch and buy domestic, right? And so there's that tension there for people in the MAGA camp who like tariffs. They're trying to have the best of both worlds where they're saying, oh, we want to just have Americans buy domestically. That'll spur manufacturing output and blah, 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 and employment in U.S. industry. Oh, and we'll get all this wonderful revenue from taxing imports. And it's like, well, if the tariff is high enough that it causes people just to buy American or, to largely switch their business to American producers, well, then if you're not importing as much, you're not getting the tariff revenue because those imports aren't occurring, right? So there's that element. All right. Okay. Federal asset sales, the purple row, that is showing $1.1 trillion worth of sales over the 11-year stretch. And that's entirely feasible. A while ago, during the Obama years, I wrote an article where I outlined, with real numbers and looking at actual government property, I outlined $1.6 trillion in liquid assets that the U.S. federal government owns. Stuff like, at least on paper, they own a bunch of gold. They have oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They've got a bunch of mineral deposits offshore. The government owns a bunch of land. Depending on the source you look at, the federal, of all the acreage of real estate in the United States, the federal government owns something like 27%. And then if you just look at Western lands, the federal government owns something like 47%. Right? There are some large Western states where the federal government is by far the majority landowner. Okay, so the point is you could sell off a lot of stuff and raise easily $100 billion a year without crashing the prices of these assets. And it's not like, oh, so they're going to just sell off Yellowstone to the highest bidder, and then we're going to see a bunch of billboards and Disney World's going to be in there with their rides. No, they could sell off what I'm showing here, and you would not notice a change in your day-to-day life. And if you want to take the kids to the Grand Canyon, you would not see a bunch of casinos there, right? That they would not have to sell treasured public property to corporations in order to have an annual $100 billion of asset sales. Okay? Because again, I'm not just talking about real estate. I just picked that as an example to show the federal government right now is sitting on a bunch of assets. So if we're thinking, oh, gee, we got to really tighten our belt here. We got to cut spending and do some stuff. We got to juice economic growth. So we're going to actually have a tax cut. And we want to do something in the interim for the economy to grow and the spending cuts to fully kick in to try to deal with this mismatch. Large federal asset sales could be a way to bridge that gap. Okay, and that's what I'm proposing here. Okay, so given that outline, then you can see what does that do to the annual deficit? The actual $1.9 trillion in 2024 under this proposal would jump to $3.1 trillion in 2025. 2026, it falls again down to $2.2 trillion, but that's still higher than what 2024 was because then you have a bunch of those spending cuts that kick in. Okay, and then it just drifts down over time because the growth in the receipts is higher than the growth in the spending. And so that's why that deficit shrinks over time until finally in the year 2035, for the first time, we're projecting a surplus of, happens to be $261 billion that year. Okay? So the idea is this plan, if the government did it and stuck to these numbers, makes the deficit spike in the short term, but eventually it does give us a balanced budget by the year 2035. And then from that point forward, again, if they kept the sound economic policies in place, it would be able to run a string of surpluses. And so they'd be able to gently nibble and start shrinking the absolute stock of the government debt. The treasury debt held by the public would shrink, in 2035, it shrinks by $261 billion. But in terms, the really economically significant thing is just so long as it is slightly falling, well, if the economy is still growing at whatever, 5-6% in real GDP terms per year, well, then the debt relative to the size of the economy is going to really start sinking rapidly. And that's ultimately the measure of how big is the debt. It's like how big is it as a share of the economy. I mean, strictly speaking, it's how big is it as a share of federal revenue. That's more like the debt to income ratio that a company would use or a household. But it's pretty standard in this literature to look at the debt to GDP figure. And I'm saying you don't need to have massive $1 trillion annual surpluses to be paying down the debt. As long as you just had a surplus, then you kind of grow out of the problem. Okay, last thing just on that point, the debt held by the public, it shows it was like $28.7 trillion in reality at the end of 2024. So under this proposal, it maxes out in the year 2034 at a whopping $43.8 trillion, and then it falls slightly in the next year because, again, we're assuming they have a surplus. All right, so that's certainly higher than the $28.7 trillion. It's probably higher, too, than what it would be in with current legislation. And the big reason for that is this plan has getting rid of the income tax, right? So that causes a huge hole in the federal budget over the next 10 years. Okay. But the point is, if they coupled that with massive spending cuts that weren't quite as big in the short term, eventually they could turn that corner. So again, my question is, in terms of your own framework, how would you evaluate a plan like this? Now, if you're going to say, oh, this is all fine and good, but they're not going to stick to this, right? Yeah, they would go ahead and do it, get the popularity of these massive tax cuts in the near term, get reelected in landslides in the midterms and blah, blah, blah. But then when it comes time in 2026 for them to cut the military budget in half, they'd come up with a reason, oh, we can't do that this year because there's this crisis. No. Okay, maybe that's true. So if you want to say, but even there, I still think it's worthwhile to go through this exercise to ask yourself, how would you feel about this if they could actually do it? Because I think some people would say, no, I still wouldn't support it for the reasons we said. But others might say, yeah, if I actually thought they would do this, that would be great. I just don't think they're going to do it. They wouldn't stick to it, so I don't trust them. Okay, and that's fair. I don't have a problem with you saying that. Last thing I'll mention is, what about inflation? So again, a lot of people who were objecting to the so-called big, beautiful bill were saying, oh, if they just had, they make the Trump tax cuts permanent, they throw in some other tax cuts like taxes on tips and whatnot, and they have some nibbling around the edges of spending, but no, spending is still growing in absolute terms under this thing, and that's just going to make this much more added to the debt over the next 10 years. We can't support that because they'll say, don't fool yourself. There might be giving you a tax cut, but inflation is going to be higher because look at all this extra debt. And so therefore, don't fool yourself. So there, I appreciate the cynicism, don't get me wrong, but I just want to be clear, the mechanism, it is not just an automatic given that if the federal government runs a deficit and makes the debt that much higher, that inflation necessarily goes up proportionally. Those are two separate things. All right. So inflation occurs when the Federal Reserve buys assets and creates more reserves in the system, and then that gives the commercial banks the wherewithal to expand their loans and to create more money in the broad sense of the term. Okay, there's various monetary aggregates and so on, right? So in and of itself, strictly speaking, the federal government borrowing money from people by issuing more treasury bonds or securities, because they could be bills and notes, the treasury, by issuing more treasury debt, borrowing more money from the private sector in order to fund a deficit, that by itself does not create more dollars. Now, it's true in practice, the two often go hand in hand. All right, so I'm not being naive and I'm not saying there's no connection at all, but I just want people to understand the mechanism and how it actually works. During the Obama years, for example, I think there was a 4-year stretch where the federal budget deficit was higher than $1 trillion for each of those 4 years, which is just unheard of for peacetime going into that. Back in the year 2006, the idea of the federal government having a deficit that was bigger than $1 trillion would have shocked people. Okay, but then that became the norm during the Obama years. This was also the period when the Federal Reserve began its so-called quantitative easing or QE programs, which involved what? Them buying a bunch of mortgage-backed securities, yes, but also a bunch of treasuries and adding it to their balance sheet. And when you say the Federal Reserve buys assets, what does that mean? That Bernanke was out cutting lawns in order to raise the money to buy some bonds? No, they just create the money electronically, quote, out of thin air. The federal government, the Federal Reserve, when it buys assets electronically, creates the money with which to complete this transaction. Okay, that's new high-powered money that comes into the system by the actual act of the transaction. Okay, so I don't think those things were unrelated. The Federal Reserve could say, oh no, we're not monetizing the debt, or we're not monetizing the deficit. It's not like we're just running the printing press to cover the government shortfall. But if the Treasury issues $1 trillion in new bonds, and then the Fed creates $1 trillion in new money to buy $1 trillion of bonds off of the balance sheet of private sector dealers, it's a large shell game in which effectively the Federal Reserve created $1 trillion and that covered the government's deficit that period. Those weren't the exact numbers. I'm just showing you conceptually what I'm talking about, right? So, yes, in the real world, there is a tight connection between government deficit spending and central bank monetary inflation. And that's partly why the governments of the world create central banks, because they're sort of accomplices in their skullduggery, I would say. Okay. But conceptually, economically, they are distinct things. And so the mere fact that the Treasury is running up more debt, if bondholders around the world saw this plan and they thought, oh, yeah, they're borrowing a bunch more money, but it's because they've got this credible plan where they're trying to jumpstart U.S. economic growth with massive income tax reductions, then they're putting the tariffs in place to try to staunch the bleeding. They're doing the asset sales. And look at, I think if they did see massive spending cuts in 2026 in this plan, and then the line was held on the growth in spending going forward, I think that they would say, okay, yeah, the Treasury's good for it. It looks like they've got a plan that we, we're not worried about them missing a payment because they're just, they're getting buried in red ink here. No, they got a plan. They're going to be above water by 2035. And okay, I think they would think that. If, again, they had a credible plan, they had people explaining what they were doing, and they showed in the early period, yeah, we did massive tax cuts, but we also significantly cut government spending amidst the cries of protest from various special interest groups and whatnot, right? I think that's what you would need to communicate to the financial sector around the world, that, hey, we're serious about doing this. Just give us time and we'll show you that we mean business about serious fiscal reform. And so that would mean the investors around the world would be willing to load up on more Treasury debt. Again, I remember I had the yields increase from 3.6% to 4%, right? To make them more attractive on the margin. Like, why would you have a higher allocation in your portfolio to Treasuries? Well, because the yield's a little bit higher than it otherwise would have been. So, okay, yeah. And as long as you don't doubt their ability to repay, okay. Also keep in mind, the private sector savings rate would go through the roof by getting rid of the income tax, right? Because the income tax doesn't just tax work, it taxes savings, right? It penalizes you for saving. If you have $1,000 that you got from your job, you got the income tax hit it the first time. If you spend it, the income tax doesn't hit it again. You might get hit with sales taxes and whatnot. But if you invest it, or you just put it into a bank CD and you earn $20 in interest, well, that interest is also taxed by the income tax because that's interest income, right? So you get hit coming and going in terms of income. And so the income tax, among other problems, it penalizes saving. So you get rid of the income tax, American households and businesses are going to save a lot more than they did in 2024. And so when you're asking, well, gee, where's the government going to be able to borrow all this money from? Well, the people that I just gave this humongous tax cut to, amongst others. So that's one way of explaining that. And hence, there's no intrinsic reason with this fiscal plan that the Federal Reserve, looking at this situation, would feel pressure like, oh yeah, we need to start loading up on more treasuries to keep their yields from going through the roof. I don't think they would need to do that. Okay. All right. Well, that's a great place to stop. Hope you folks benefited from this. Again, last time I'll say it. The point of this is not me saying, this is the Murphy plan, copyright. No, I am just trying to show possibilities and to keep things somewhat realistic. As listeners probably know, particularly if you've been following my career from pre-infineo days, I'm a very radical libertarian, right? So I think federal government services, if they're legitimate, should be privatized, and if they're illegitimate, should just not be done. And that's like my ideal world. But I'm trying to be pragmatic here and say, I realize we're not going to get that kind of world next Thursday. So in the interim, let me start with how they're doing things right now, and let me show a proposal that, yes, is aggressive, but is within the realm of possibility in terms of actual DC politics, and just to show what is possible in the existing system. And then to ask yourself, take your own principles and run through this wind tunnel and just see, how do you feel about something like this? Okay, folks, thanks for your attention. See you next time.